cracking sensory codes using individual differences. The idea of cracking codes is ambitious, and maybe even a bit grandiose, and yet I mean it. For the last 20 years, I've been the disciple of an idea, and there have been very few other people who've adhered to this idea. And now, after all these years, it seems like there's a new consensus, a paradigm shift, if you will, and it's the idea that individual differences provide a royal road to understanding information processing. Information processing as it relates to things like genetics, development, the brain, the senses, perception, and cognition. A good place to start with all of this is with Lee Cronbach, the famous mathematical psychologist who in 1957 was the president of the American Psychological Association. And in his keynote address in the paper that followed, he reviewed about 80 years of scientific psychology that had preceded him. And in the end, he chose to write about two mutually exclusive disciplines of scientific psychology, two separate disciplines that had essentially evolved separately, and practitioners in one tended to be fairly dismissive of practitioners in the other, as a general rule. One of these approaches was experimental, as he called it, and the other was factor analytic or correlational, as he termed it. The focus of the experimental approach was on average differences across experimental conditions. If there's a mean difference in one condition versus another condition, then that significant difference was considered to be important, and that approach was essentially the search for significant differences, as opposed to the factor analytic or correlational approach that saw individual differences within an experimental condition as being extraordinarily meaningful. So, within the experimental approach, normal individual differences were essentially a nuisance variable. They were seen as error variance, measurement error, something to be minimized, as opposed to the factor analytic or correlational approach, which saw these normal individual differences as very meaningful. They reflected some true variability in the system, and that true variability, along with some error, was what you wanted to look at. That true variability was essentially, as I said before, the royal road to psychological process. Now, Cronbach advocated for an integration of these two scientific approaches. He felt that psychology, as well as many biological disciplines, had essentially shortchanged themselves by allowing these two separate approaches to evolve so separately and antagonistically. He wasn't the first or the last person to be aware of these sorts of issues or suggest an integration, and yet in 1957, he was extraordinarily influential in putting forward this approach. And so 50 years ago, numerous disciplines attempted an integration. But for the most part, the sensory sciences and cognitive science and much of neural science didn't really take note of this integration. And in particular, they didn't seem to take note of the whole individual differences or correlational approach. For the most part, it was an experimental endeavor. Think, for instance, about experiments involving things like adaptation, masking, subthreshold summation. The whole idea is to look for differences between one condition and the other, a purely experimental approach. Well, all of this led to my 1987 plan for global domination and reproductive success. And essentially that involved creating a second discipline of vision science. And so there I was. I was interested in studying infant vision, and I wasn't the first or the last person to think along these lines, but I was especially interested in a science that would integrate the use of correlational or factor analytic approaches, covariance approaches, which would allow me to understand underlying visual processes. Originally, I was interested in contrast sensitivity in infants, but it expanded into a whole lot more. Some people would argue that the origins of experimental psychology, including the study of sensory individual differences, can be traced back to 1796, when an astronomer dismissed his assistant for making seemingly inaccurate measurements. In short, Neville Maskelyne, Astronomer Royal, fired his assistant David Kinnebrook for what he called irregular and confused, but consistently slow detection of stellar transit times. Basically, the idea was that there had to be something wrong with Kinnebrook. He just couldn't get the measurements right, and so he was fired for consistent errors. Now, this episode and other individual differences came to the attention of Frederick Bessel, who thought that he could improve his own science of astronomy by taking into account individual differences in observers, and so he studied differences in temporal detection among astronomers. He introduced what's now known as the personal equation, an attempt to correct for constant differences in well-practiced observers. Now, Bessel wanted to factor out this involuntary constant difference for his own work, and it was left to others to ponder the importance of this for understanding humans and human information processing. It's worth noting that Bessel is interesting to sensory scientists because of his invention of what are now known as Bessel functions and for his use of motion parallax for determining the distance of stars. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a true science of individual differences emerged. The people who created this science called themselves psychometricians, and they were interested in ranking individuals in terms of their human abilities. Francis Galton seems to have pioneered the modern study of sensory individual differences. Galton was not primarily interested in understanding sensory and neural processes, and so he'll be of limited use to us. But rather, he was interested and obsessed even with measuring and rating human intellectual and physical traits. And within this quest, sensory performance figured heavily in his theorizing and in his research. He believed, wrongly, that simple sensory measures could provide a reasonable measure of overall ability. So in Galton, one finds the origins of modern statistical theory, including correlation, regression, and factor analysis. One also finds assessments of sensory and cognitive abilities, such as individual auditory thresholds and measurements of mental imagery. Moreover, Galton pioneered the use of twin studies for studying heredity. But in Galton, we don't find much sophisticated theorizing about vision and about sensory and cognitive codes. James McKean Cantell was originally an experimentalist who trained in Wundt's lab, but he became very interested in individual differences, and he brought these notions back to the Americas. And like Galton, he was interested in sensory processing because he thought it would provide a good index of human abilities. He was less interested in actually understanding the processes underlying vision. But 100 years ago, Cattell did have a student who was interested in using individual differences to understand sensory processes. William Carl Rudiger later became an educational psychologist, but in his 1907 dissertation, he clearly spelled out a science of individual differences to be used to study sensory processing. As far as I know, this paper was largely ignored over the years, and the author didn't really go back to it. And yet now, 100 years later, you can get this paper for free from Google Library. Charles Spearman was another person who initially began with Wilhelm Wundt, but then was greatly influenced by Galton. In 1904, he invented factor analysis as part of an experiment to, quote, find out whether, as Galton has indicated, the abilities commonly taken to be intellectual had any correlation with each other or with sensory discrimination, end quote.